17, 1 through 13, the Transfiguration. Amen. We now come to this amazing account of the Transfiguration of Christ on the mountain. This dramatic event marks a major turning point in the gospel narrative. For Jesus was beginning to turn more and more toward Jerusalem for the suffering and the death that awaited him there. But before all of this would take place, there was this glimpse of glory. And we read in the New Testament that it was because of the glory that was set before him, he was able to endure the Christ. The revelation of Christ's glory in this chapter was a clear confirmation to the disciples of the truth of Peter's confession of faith, 16:16. But it was also a great encouragement for Christ himself as he faced the agony that would occur on another hill called Golgotha. Amen. As we continue, we may divide this passage into three major parts for our analysts. We have the record of the event of the Transfiguration, verse 1 through 3. Second, we have Peter's suggestions and the divine response to it, verses 4 through 8. And the third, we have the instruction by Jesus and the questions by the disciples, verse 9 through 13. The event currently is the base and key to the entire passage. It simply reports what happened without going into such detail and as the other narratives. But in the other two sections, we have an important dialogue. The second part has Peter's suggestions, followed by the voice from heaven. This revelation struck terror in the disciples, but the fear was relieved by Jesus' words of comfort. So there are three speeches in the second part to be considered. Then there's three sections which in the aftermath of the event also has three speeches. An instruction followed by a question, followed by an answer. What is interesting is that in the event, Jesus does not explain the transfiguration at all. The voice from heaven explains who Jesus is, but not why Moses or Elijah are there on the mountain. We are left with a number of questions, as indeed the disciples must have been as well. The account of the transfiguration occurred in the other two Gospels, as well as Mark 9, 2 through 12, tells us that his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. Mark also tells us that Peter did not know what he was saying, for he was frightened. Mark did not recall all the voice from heaven said, leaving out in whom I am well pleased. As Mark tells us, the disciples kept the matter to themselves, discussing what raising from the dead means. And in Jesus' answer about Elijah, we see that there was more conversation than Matthew records. Jesus also at the time reasoned why it is written that the Son of Man must suffer and must be rejected. Jesus was explaining why the kingdom had not been established if Elijah had not already come. Luke has some different things, 9, 28 through 36. Whereas the other gospel said it took place 6 days, Luke said about 8 days. Luke tells us that they went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, he was transfigured. His face changed and his clothing became white as the lightning. Luke tells us that Moses and Elijah also was in a glorious splendor. They spoke to Jesus about the departure that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Luke records that same words from heaven that Mark has, but Luke does not include the discussion about Elijah. All three of the so-called Gospels has the same thing, that each was to tell an account of their own ways according to their purpose. Our focus will be on what Matthew actually says, but we will interpret it in the line with all the reports of what happened. Even though they could be there with their passing in the text, it may be helpful to deal with it now. Peter wanted to make 3 tabernacles or shelters or booths. He was thinking of the fest or the tabernacle. But what prompted him to think of that, the account tells us he was afraid and did not know what he was saying. I take that means that his timing was wrong for the suggestion. For this was not the time. The festival of the tabernacle was celebrated every year by the Jews. It commemorated the wilderness wandering of the temporary sojourner of the people until they settled in the land. The people, therefore, would build the little shelters and live in them for a week, only to come out of them at the end, at the great day of the festival, where with relief might add, where much relief we might add. The 7-day festival was not only commemorated the temporary sojourn of the people in the wilderness, but in this age of the final great days was celebrated for the settlement in the land and in the future. That is why it comes to the end. That's why it comes at the end of the calendar year. Peter had heard Jesus said about a week earlier that some who were sitting there would not taste death before they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew 16:28. Now on the mountain, Peter saw Christ in all his glory. He insisted, we have been talking about the shelter for the great celebration. We do not know how well Peter knew that the prophecy literally of the Bible by Zechariah made it clear that in the kingdom, the people will celebrate the feast of the tabernacle. Peter had the right idea in general, but the wrong time, for Christ had not died first. It is interesting that Matthew said this took place about 6 days. Luke says about 8 days. Peter's great confession might not have been made on the Sabbath day. And then after the 6 days and nights of the next Sabbath or morning of the first day of the week, the 8th day, the Lord appeared in his glory. If it is correct, and it is the only meaning of the day that makes sense, that similarity of a Sunday transformation and a Sunday significance. So anyway, as far as this is telling us about how you could be in the right place and not be in the right mind at the right time. You know, you could know Jesus, but yet you will not trust him. You know, this is why he had to appear to the disciples. You know, they had been following him. They had been on the mountain praying with him, but they still doubted him. And, you know, that's the problem with the world today. You know, we as Christians, you know, we know the word. We know that Jesus is the Lord, the King of Kings. But, you know, sometimes he had to do some things in our lives to get us to really come to the full knowledge and the full understanding of who he is. You know, a lot of times we take things and people for granted, and situations occur in our life, you know, that if it had not been for Jesus, we would not be able to make it through. You know, and the same with the disciples. You know, they knew him, and, you know, he had taken care of them. He had showed them all kind of miracles, but then he had to do the transformation in order for them to really accept and believe who he was. And that's what's going on in the world today. You know, we are so consumed about the president and all the things that are going on around us that we really can't focus on what we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on Jesus and knowing that he died and he lives and he was risen. The resurrection of God. That's what this whole thing is talking about today. This lesson that we are reading today is the transformation. You know, I thank God that I too have made a change because of him. You know, because of what he's done in my life. You know, and it drawed me closer to him, and now I know that he lives, and I know that he will take care of me, and he will lead me and guide me. So this morning, I just wanted to speak to you for a few minutes on this topic, and we will be doing a little further study on this. We need to get to the real truth of this topic today. Amen? Amen. All right. Thank you. So now at this time, as we move on, I'd like to open up the doors of the church at this time and ask that if anyone that doesn't know the Lord, as they